Bienvenue au séminaire en informatique cognitive. Je suis enchanté d'accueillir Jean-Baptiste MOURET de Nancy, qui connaît Montréal. Est-ce que tu as déjà été à l'UQAM ou à l'Université de Montréal,
Non,
Jean-Baptiste?
malheureusement, non.
Non. Donc, tu n'as pas été à Montréal?
Peut-être pas.
Non, parce que je croyais comprendre.
Si, j'étais à Montréal, mais pas à l'université.
Ah, d'accord.
Il y a NeurIPS régulièrement, différentes conférences.
Donc, bienvenue. Euh, Je vais te présenter comme directeur de recherche à l'INRIA Nancy, Grand Est, et membre de l'équipe Larsen, c'est en anglais, Lifelong Autonomy and Interaction Skills for Robots in a Sensing Environment. Ça, c'est Larsen. La recherche porte sur l'apprentissage par les machines et le calcul évolutif pour développer les robots adaptatifs qui peuvent apprendre et s'adapter par des méthodes de essais-erreurs. Son œuvre Robots that can adapt like animals, publiée dans Nature en 2015, a démontré que les robots les robots sont capables de se récupérer du dommage en 2 minutes avec des répertoires comportementaux. Il a eu des positions à Cornell, à l'Université Cornell, l'Université de Vermont et Technische Universität Darmstadt. Aujourd'hui, il va nous parler des agents adaptatifs incorporés avec les implications pour l'ancrage. Ça m'intéresse beaucoup ce qu'il veut dire par l'ancrage. Mais le passé de tout ça, c'est que les robots travaillent dans un environnement dans le monde qui est complexe et varié. Et plutôt que dans les simulations ou des jeux comme l'échec. Et puis, à l'époque, c'était les modèles symboliques, les méthodes symboliques qui prévalaient. Mais depuis, c'est l'apprentissage qui a pris sa place et qui est, à ma connaissance, beaucoup plus performant que des symboles et les règles préconnues. I'm very happy to recommend to welcome everybody to the seminar in cognitive informatics. Jean-Baptiste MOURET from Nancy, you've seen his summary, is here to speak about adaptive embodied agents, implications for grounding, and I will not steal any more of his time. Bienvenue, Jean-Baptiste, c'est à toi.
Okay, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to speak about all of this. And mostly, so my talk will not be that much about my own work, but trying to put things in perspective, including the things I did, but also more generally a bit of history about where we come from in robotics and what's going on now. Most probably you all know that a lot of things are going on right now. There's a huge interest in robotics right now compared to a few years ago. So I try to explain all these things combined together where we are in robotics. And yeah, the key question will be symbols. So first, I want to start with a very, very generic introduction, because the question that I always get, especially from journalists, it's what is a robot? With simple questions like, is my dishwasher a robot? Is, I don't know, cooking robot a robot? It's called a robot, so probably it is. So the way I see it, and you will see that it's important to understand the rest, is that actually robotics is a spectrum. So on the left, you have these specialized machines, and on the right, you have the most generalist robots, so probably humanoid, something like this. And in between, you have tons of robots that are all robots, but less versatile. So basically, the more versatile you are, the more robots you are. And ultimately, we are very interested in solving the robots on the right, but all the robots in between are also very useful. And the reason why a cooking robot is called a robot is that you can make several recipes with it. The reason why an industrial manipulator is called a robot is that you can use the same robot on different factory problems. And each time we go to the right, we go to more generalist. So the goal for robotics research, at least in my opinion, is to design this most generalist robot. Maybe one of the ideas is that once we know how to do this, we can do more specialized robots, we can make them. Maybe just like the big resource question. But everything in robotics is how can I build something which is more generalist than before. So typically what every roboticist had in mind since the beginnings is there is a robot, I ask something like go to fetch a beer in the fridge, for instance. And the robot can do it. That means that it can move, that means it can understand what we're asking, that means that it knows what we're talking about. And all these things need to be combined together to get this generalist robot, because then, of course, we can ask very different things, and the robot should still be able to do it. So in this talk, we'll mostly try to think about the role of symbols in robotics, and going back to the start of robotics, a bit of history to put some context. I will explain a big phase of robotics, which is still ongoing, which is learning without symbols, to try to avoid symbols and show some results on this. But then I will jump to large language models, because they are really changing a lot of things in robotics right now, so that's current news. So we try to explain how this is connected to what has been done before and what new challenges are raised by large language models in robotics. So let's start with the beginning. I love this video. You can find it on YouTube. It's the first robot. It's called at least the first robot designed to study artificial intelligence. It's called Shaky. If you go to Mountain View in California, you can see it in the museum. It was done at Stanford Research Institute. And the goal was to have a robot that does the kind of things we have always in mind, like ask something, the robot can do it. It's a mobile robot. At that time, it was already very challenging to make a robot like this, like a camera. We had to use TV cameras with analog. We didn't have screens like we have now, of course, at that time. But still, the robot does what we are still working on. There is a world with cubes, with an environment. We ask to go somewhere, the robot has to plan where to go, use the camera to perceive the obstacles. Everything was already there at that time, at least as a challenge. And you have seen maybe at the beginning, it's a fun part of the video, this daemon that moves the environment because the real environment is dynamic. So here, some external event is changing the environment. So what was the way it was working at that time is still more or less used by most robots now, which is called the sense plan act paradigm in robotics, which is we first sense, so it can be camera, laser, radar. Then we transform all of this into a word representation. We find the optimal plan, that's the plan part, and then we act. That means that we execute these sections. Typically, the plan will have several steps, and we'll execute several steps, then go back to new sensing. So typically, the robot will look at the world, think a bit, like a process, plan, execute some parts, then stop and do it again. It was, of course, very influential, and the way it was working behind the hood was how do I plan with the world? So the way it was working is that we were transforming the world into symbols. So I don't know, A, B, and cube, and things like this. And like a symbol for door, a symbol for objects that we're manipulating if we're manipulating an object, and so on. And then it was using formal logics to try to find a way of solving the plan, which means reaching the new state. So very basically, the kind of formal logics we're speaking of are things like A and B implies C, C implies D. Therefore, we could say that A and B implies D, and these kind of things. But the key problem here was how do I express knowledge about the world in this kind of predicates, with things on which we can reason with a computer. And at that time, they say, okay, maybe it's not that much of a problem. The first problem is to do the planning. and they work a lot on planning, which is essentially like playing chess as a proxy for intelligence, and that's completely discorrelated from the body. So first phase was looking at the world, transforming this into symbols, and then planning in that world. The problem is that that did not work for two reasons that you might know. The first is what's called the frame problem. So this is an extract from a book by Steve Pinker that you probably know, in which he is imagining a robot that is designed to fetch a spare battery from a room, and in that room there is also a time bomb. So in the version 1, there is a battery which battery is on the wagon, and the robot sees that if it pulls the wagon out of the room, the battery will come with it. But unfortunately, the bomb was also on the wagon, and the robot did not know about this, did not check, and the robot failed to deduce that pulling the wagon out brought the bomb too, so the robot explodes. So then we try to program all the side effects, and we realize very quickly that there are so many rules in the world that we cannot encode all this common sense in a problem with predicates. And the conclusion is that it's more or less impossible to give this common sense. There is always a way of forgetting some rule of the world. So another simpler example is if I ask you to bring me some coffee. Without any context, could be many things. Do I ask for coffee beans? Maybe if I'm in a shop, I mean coffee beans. Do I mean coffee as drink? Maybe a coffee tree, I don't know. And then maybe the robot cannot know that when I ask for coffee, I expect to have a cup. Maybe I will give me, I don't know, a bottle or something like this. And depending on the context also, maybe if I'm organizing an event, when I say, bring me some coffee, I need 5 liters of coffee so I can give it to the people in the seminar. But if I'm alone at work, I expect a mug of coffee. So all of this needs rules to be encoded to understand what we mean by these symbols. And this is why we never managed to get something based on symbols and formal logics to work in robots. The second problem is the symbol grounding. For instance, a very simple thing is what is a chair? Do we say that's an object with 4 legs? But there are tons of objects with 4 legs that are not chairs, like, I don't know, an elephant has 4 legs, it's not a chair. But there are also chairs with 3 legs, or chairs without legs at all. Is it something on which we can sit? But then there are things on which we can sit that are not necessarily chairs. So we did not know how we take images, so some perception images or anything more complicated than this, and then transform this into symbols on which we can reason. So that somehow failed for robotics. It didn't fail in other fields. That's really the first phase of robotics, is all this symbolic AI. We describe the world with logic, and we have the frame problem, no common sense, and no way of connecting to the cube world with this shaky robot, which is really like the grandfather of all the robots right now. Then in the 80s, several people came, but mostly the most vocal one was Rodney Brooks. So the end of the 80s. Then he clearly said, stop all these things. We don't need to reason, plan, and see the world as a chessboard. We need robots that can react. Look at an animal, like, I don't know, a small insect. It does not have a pure world model, does not play chess. He is capable of surviving the world without all of this. So he said, for instance, he wrote in some papers, I believe that humans' level intelligence is too complex and little understood to be correctly decomposed into the white species at the moment. And we'll never understand how to decompose human level intelligence till we have a lot of practice with simpler level intelligence. So the goal is to say, can we just go back a bit and make like simple reactive agents that do not look at the world with symbols, but just react to it? And maybe we can build on that, start with a simple insect-like behaviors, and then go from that to something more complicated. And ultimately, we might need symbols, but we not start with that. So he proposed at that time some called subsumption, which probably is not relevant at all right now. What is interesting is that this led to the Roomba robot that you probably know. So this vacuum cleaner robot, which very interestingly has no symbols at all, but can still do a quite useful and complex task, which is vacuuming your room, and does not even use a map. The way it works is by doing some reactive behaviors with some random variations and a few very simple behaviors like this that are all combined together. So it's really the opposite of the shaky robot that we had before. No symbols, but a robot that actually works and not even using the kind of things that as humans we want to see. It's like, oh, let's start by building a map. But the point of view at that time from Brooks is, yeah, we can still do it without the map, and it led to a very successful product like this. So that's the second phase is something that Brooks had a paper called Elephants Don't Play Chess. So we can look at animals and simpler forms of intelligence and just avoid the symbols and build from that. So in that case, the robots should build their own representation. There could be symbols that emerge, but there is no explicit symbol. And mostly reactive behaviors, and that we can either design by hand, but mostly we'd like to learn or to get them to somehow evolve from the interaction from the environment. So we reach a point at which say, okay, now we want to learn behaviors. And the main idea from this is now called reinforcement learning, which is a complex way of mostly saying learning by trial and error. And theoretically, in general, it's with an unknown system. So I have a system, I can try something on it, I get some reward, and the goal is to maximize the expected reward. So typically on a robot, that means that I will run the robot for some time. If the robot succeeds in the task, you get a reward. And then the goal of the learning algorithm is to find the parameters that are the most likely to maximize this reward. So in the early work on reinforcement learning, we had discrete actions and discrete worlds. So that's typically what we have on the picture here. That's a maze with small squares. And the goal is to, you have a small agent like a mouse, you want to find the cheese at the end of the maze, and you explore it randomly, more or less, with your agent. And then once you get there, you start to understand what are the sequence of actions that led to this reward. And then you start building the kind of things we have on the bottom, which is a policy. So what to do in every state. In that state, you need to go forward. In that state, you need to go right, and so on. There are several challenges that are clearly found when we started to work on this. The first is what's called the credit assignment. So we get a reward once we reach the cheese, but how do we assign the credit on all the actions that led to that? There is no gradient, which is a problem for computer scientists. Essentially, we don't know how to optimize this. Because usually we don't have access to the world and we cannot compute the derivatives of the world. So we had to find different ways. And typically that requires also a lot of trials. So that's very hard to do on a real robot. And we have to rely on simulation. There is another view of trial and error, which is to look at evolution. So you probably all know basic evolutionary theory. We have population. Some individuals survive better than others. They are selected. The ones that are selected have a chance of reproducing. There are some more crossed, and then we go to the next generation. And iteratively, by try and error, we get to a solution. But before going to evolution, there were a lot of successes with reinforcement learning. So until 2015, mostly reinforcement learning was not working on robots. It was a very open problem and nothing was really convincing for robots. But then in 2015, a few papers started to combine reinforcement learning with deep learning. So deep learning is essentially a way of using learning on actual images. And again, to remove these symbols, remove the processing part. So before that, what we did for reinforcement learning is to try to go back to this square world. So we look at the environment, we make the equivalent of squares and actions that are discrete like this, and then we try to find the policy. And of course, the real world is not like this. The real world is not squares or symbols. And that's very similar to what we had at the beginning with Shaky. So what deep learning brought is that to use directly raw data, so pixels from a camera, so that we can learn by trial and error using these pixels. The most famous work on this is probably the Atari game playing, that's on the right. And it shows the Atari games because they are simple, but also because there were many of them. So you could show that the same algorithm can learn many games. So not only be good at one game, but be good at many games. So that's essentially, in that case, learning what we call a Q function, which is in a value, a Q. So it's a function that for every state action pairs give you how good it is, and you want to learn this. So the key thing is that it was working with raw pixels, but of course you see the pixels here are much simpler than the real world. So what about robots? And maybe, again, the whole point here is that we try to suppress the symbols. So in our team, we work on this kind of question with real robots. It was more or less at the same time, so 2015. So one of the work we did is to say, okay, we want to have a problem that actually requires adaptation so that learning can make a difference, but we do not want to use symbols at all. So the starting point is that we had this 6-leg robot. You see here, it's working, and we break it. So in that case, we pull a wire out so that the robot is not working anymore. And the key assumption here is that the robot has no way of making a diagnostic. It does not know what's wrong. It just sees that it's not working forward anymore. And that's actually something that happens very often in real life with robots, is that it's very, very hard to know when something is broken and what is actually broken. It's like debugging a complex machine. So usually we don't know. So here we try to say, okay, let's say that I have no way of knowing what's wrong with my robot. The only thing that I know is that it's not moving forward anymore. How can I solve this by try and error? So this is what we designed, is that we took inspiration from evolution. So the way evolution adapts to changes. So you probably know that there have been 5 mass extensions, at least that we understood so far, in the history of life. So you all know the extensions of dinosaurs, obviously. So that's Cretaceous Tertiary extinction, in which 75% of species disappeared on Earth, but much more than just the dinosaurs. But actually, there were more in the past, and our estimates, at least for now, are even worse than the dinosaurs. So something like, for instance, in the Eurovisian Silurian, it's 85% of species. But we still, there's still life on Earth, and the reason why it works is diversity. So if you have tons of species that are all living differently, like feeding from different sources, living in different environments, when something changes, you can adapt by just being adapted to the new environment. So for this, you need a lot of diversity. For instance, if you have some species that are actually living in desert, so hot environment, something, and the world becomes hotter, these species are likely to survive. Whereas some species that are only adapt to cold climates might not survive. So you need this diversity to not anticipate for the change, but to be able to adapt to a change that you cannot anticipate. So we designed something like this on robots. We have an offline phase, so something in simulation, in which we do thousands of simulations to generate species of working behaviors. That means robots that can walk using all their legs, robots that work with the body tilted forward, robots that have different ways of working, essentially. And we put this into the memory of the robot. And then if damage is happening on the robot, so if the robot do not work anymore, the idea is to quickly search for, in this behavior, one that still works. So in terms of symbols, what we really are doing here is that we are not thinking in advance about what could go wrong, but we still want to be able to learn quickly, so we don't start from a blank page. we will use all this diversity of diverse behaviors, like all the species on Earth, and then hope that one of them still works in spite of the damage. And that's much easier than learning from scratch. That can be prepared by diversity, and that's a way of learning by trial and error that is actually very effective. So this is what we have the first step. We search with an evolutionary algorithm many different ways of working. So you see a few examples here. At the end, we put all of them in a kind of map in which we have 13,000 behaviors here. So 13,000 ways of working that are all the best of their species. So it's same thing as in nature. In a given niche, by definition of what a niche is, you have only the species that is the most adapted to that niche. So here you have the best working behavior with 6 legs, the best working behavior with the body tilted backward, and so on. Of course, they are not all good, so that's why you see that the map is not uniform, because if you're only using 2 legs, you're not moving as fast as using only 4 legs, using 4 legs or 6 legs. So sometimes you cannot do as well as what you can do when you're undamaged, and that's expected. But you still have all this diversity in which you can take something out if something is broken. So this is the kind of things we get. Here you see the first thing that do not work. So then the robot will look at what else is most likely to work. So there is an algorithm behind called Bayesian optimization that I will not describe today, which is not very complicated, but tries to predict which behavior is most likely to work among the behaviors that we already have stored in the memory. So here you see that after 20 seconds, the robot starts to go a bit more forward in spite of this leg that's moving around. And after 30 seconds, we get this kind of behaviors. So you have seen all the trials of the robot here. And what is very nice here is that we're really adapting in real time. So this one does not work better. So at that point, we conclude we can use the behavior that we found just before. So that's 40 seconds. And it's also a very interesting gait because the robot is jumping forward, which is not something that we can easily design as humans. Somehow it's much more lifelike than the gate that we had at the beginning that we designed. You can see it's jumping forward. And this is, among all the behaviors, one behavior that still works in spite of this damage. Most probably because it's not using this leg much, but maybe it's using it in theory and it's not sensitive to it, or maybe it's very specific to the exact position of that leg when it's broken. We don't know, and that's an emergent behavior at that time. We can do other things. So to illustrate on more complex robots, this is a more recent paper in which we break the knee of this humanoid robot. And the goal in that case, we cannot learn by trial and error, because at least not on this robot, because once you start falling as a humanoid, you fall. There is I cannot fall 5 times to see how it works. So we need more like a reflex. But this is also learned by learning some diversity in simulation, so solving the problem in many ways. And then we learn from that database a classifier that tells us where to put the n with respect to the position of the wall, the posture of the robot, the current position of all the joints, and so on. So we learn a big neural network that tells us where to put the n given the situation, again, from the result of many simulations about different cases. And then we get this kind of behaviors, which is very nice because the robot can work very quickly, but again, maybe a bit, we did not expect this robot to move that fast. So it's very human-like in many ways. So you see here that the robot has time, once the problem is detected, to put the end at the right position to avoid the fall. And then, of course, the robot could try to have more time to most probably try to detect what's wrong and maybe find some way of compensating. So that's what we did in our team, but at the same time, it was a GPU time. So everybody started to use GPUs to do very large-scale simulations, and that's not about adapting, but first how to get a very, very good behavior for a robot. And this worked very well. So the key idea here is to use this, not the algorithm, evaluation algorithm that was designing here, but the previous ones with reinforcement learning, to try to get working behaviors for robots by training them on very, very different surfaces for millions of time. And it worked very well for robots. So again, here we're speaking about things that are purely trained from reward, with no conception of symbols or analysis, mostly saying, I want the robot to walk, to not fall, and sometimes giving some hints, but as few as possible. And this is the kind of things now that works very well in robotics. That is thanks to learning, is learning in simulation with a lot of randomization and different, lot of computation to try to test the neural network that will control the robot so that it does what we want, but with billions of simulations behind. So for instance, this is from a few weeks from Boston Dynamics. And these are things that were very, very hard to design with control or with approaches,
on spot is probably
with approaches based on symbolic or whatever. So very impressive dynamic skills. That's also true for humanoids. So these are humanoids that you can buy now. And they all train in simulation with reinforcement learning. So one the lesson of this is that to get to all of that, we didn't need to have symbols, world model, understanding. We mostly need to have robots that design their own representation from trial and error, from their experience. And that's very much what Brooks had in mind when he started to work on this and in the Roomba, is going away from thinking too much, but instead having robots that learn by themselves. So it's in simulation, but still they learn by themselves in the simulation by trial and error, and then the right representations, the right behaviors emerge, and not from first principles in terms of the robotics, but more first principles in terms of the learning algorithm. And this is improving every day. This video is already 6 months old, I think. You can see even better now behaviors for humanoids. So my conclusion for this is robot locomotion is more or less solved with reinforcement learning in simulation. And it can be actually fast with the GPU. And all of this is without symbols, which is really interesting in this way of robotics. The other thing that works in robotics is imitation learning. So one reason is that defining a reward is easy when you want to walk. But if you want to do another task, I don't know, like something like emptying a dishwasher, for instance, it's much harder to define exactly what we mean by this. And that's maybe emptying a dishwasher, you can define a reward, like the number of things that are still in the dishwasher. But in more general way, it's quickly becomes easier just to show what we want. So we show the behavior to the system, and then we try to have robots that can imitate. So it's something that was important in around the year 2000. But then it stopped, and there is a revival since the new deep learning results, in which we can learn directly from pixels. So before we were learning from trajectories, now we learn from pixels. And we learn from a distribution of demonstrations and possibly a prompt, something like text. So maybe you have seen these videos. They are not from our group, but I find them very interesting and impressive. So the starting point is to demonstrate what to do. So that's demonstrations of behaviors. It's called teleoperation in that case. So you see the operator as the master arms, and there are slave arms. And the slaves reproduce the motion of the master arms. And you can do a lot of things, and that's especially interesting for robotics because these are very cheap robotic arms, so compared to what we used to have. It shows that we can do quite complex tasks without complex hardware, but maybe with the right algorithm. And from that, then we can learn to imitate. So this is the same experiment here for a cooking recipe. So on the left, you have the kind of demonstration that was provided. And then the robot can do it by itself. And the reason why it's coming back is that because now we can learn this from the pixels directly from the camera, which means again that the real success behind this is to get rid of the concepts of symbols. And so the robot cooks and so on. We'll accelerate. For in our group, we do similar things with imitation learning. So here, the robot is supposed to close the dishwasher. And when we reopen it, of course, it needs to close it again. So to show that the robot is actually using its perception to make it sure that it can solve the task, which is here just to close the door. And a more recent result is called goal condition reinforcement learning. So we provide a goal, which is a state that is defined by the image on the bottom left. So that with the orange cup inside the oven, with the door closed and so on. And the goal for the robot is to reach this state. So from demonstrations, it extracts some kind of plan, but again, without explicit symbols. And it will try to reach that state. So here you see it will take the cup, put it inside. And all of this was learned from demonstration by a remote operator. So it's still a bit slow because the robot is very fast, but you can very easily fall if you move too fast. So that's why we're moving slowly. And behind you, we reach the state. So now we get to now is when ChatGPT appeared a few years ago, so I think 3 years ago now. Everybody realized that we should and could put large language models in robots. First, we all want, that's what I said at the beginning, to be able to ask something to a robot and the robot do it. And for this, we clearly say that large language models could help us to do this. They are also very good generalists. It's the strength of the modern version of AI is that you can ask something like ChatGPT, you can ask cooking recipe, but you can also ask about your homework. You can ask it to write Python code. All of this is working with the same model. So they are very generalist. And that's the kind of thing we want for an open world, this kind of generality. And very interestingly, they have some kind of common sense. And then with the way also to approach the frame problem that I was describing at the beginning, is that with this kind of common sense that comes from all the data on which it was trained, we can hope that the robot does the thing that a human would do in that context. And the reason is that large language models benefit from the experience of all the writers in the world. So it has been trained on so much text, but somehow they have the experience of the writers. So that's not embodiment in the classic way of thinking, but they do have some embodiment because all the text was written by humans. So they use the human experience to be trained. So they are not learning from demonstration, but they're still learning from human experience. And at the end, they build their own model of the world. There is no explicit representation in a large language model of symbols and the world, but there is clearly something that looks like some representation. So this is an emergent representation. So we don't have symbols, we have words, we have a chance of having some kind of common sense, and we have general.
I ask you a question, just a quick one.
Yeah.
Do you consider words to be symbols?
That's a very good question. That's my next slide, so I will go back to it. But yeah, words could be symbols. It's an open question in terms of pure symbols, but clearly they take text as inputs and not perceptions, so not raw perception. So we can try this. So if you open your favorite language model, you can write a prompt like this. You are a humanoid robot. You are in my office. Give some context. What are the steps to fetch a coffee in the kitchen? Usually it's good to say details step by step. Write the result in a way that can be processed by a robot. And you get this kind of plans. which can be directly used by a robot, and that's usually full of common sense. So for instance, this one is funny because it starts with visual cues and signs like a smell of coffee. We want to ensure that the path is clear, avoid obstacles and people. So of course, we cannot use this directly on a robot, but we see that with two lines, we already get something that is really almost usable on a robot. So the problem, and that's the question, is large language models work with words. And the problem is that the robot does not see words. It sees images, or it sees depth, or things like this. So I don't know if the words are symbols, but the most obvious way to make this work is to get some symbols from the visual perception. So this is a cup, this is a chair, and so on. Describe this in a prompt, and then ask the language model what to do. So in that respect, we bring back symbols with modern technologies. So the way it works in the current world of machine learning is to use something called a VLM, which is a visual language model. So that's the kind of models in which we show a picture and we can ask things like, what are the objects in the picture? They have been trained for that, they do work, and they get you symbols. And then we can extract the coordinates of the objects in the image, for instance. Then we transform this into a sentence. We get this to a large language model. And we usually ask for the language model to give a structured answer. So something like a JSON file like I had before, or something like a list of instructions. And when we execute this as a sequence of atomic behaviors, so things that come from some library, maybe from demonstrations. So we have already a library of demonstrations about how to do different things, like opening a door. And then the language model say you first need to open the door, activate this. What's very interesting here is that there is no need for training data because everything is basically in prompts and it's using generalist models. But it's also worrying that we go back to symbols. We don't have the frame problem in the same way as before, but we still have the symbol grounding problem, but still we get explicit symbols, but at the same time, these symbols come from a language model from the visual language model that is not that bad at giving us good symbols. For instance, chairs work very well with modern things. It has been trained on so much data that if you ask for a chair, it will actually recognize all the chairs that I had in my first slide. So we tried in our group to see how far we can go with this. So this is a recent experiment in which we asked the robot to do a simple task. So we'll see an example just after this. So pick up the mustard from the cabinet and give it to the person in the kitchen. So here what happens is that the robot look at the word with visual language model. It transforms this into a prompt that it is sent to a large language model. And this large language model then outputs a sequence of actions that's like a library of previous demonstrations, and then the robot can do it. And it works surprisingly well for what it is, at least, which is almost a hack around the large language models. For instance, here it activates the policy to open the door. So for instance, the large language model is the one that is deciding here that to get something inside the cabinet, you need to open the door first. So it's very common knowledge for you humans. But if you use classic logic, then you need to have a rule that says that you cannot take an object if the door is not open. And that's the kind of things you don't want to encode in the world. So that's the kind of basic common sense that we get for free with large language models. So a few more examples. Pick the mug in the dishwasher, place it on the table. And these kind of things work well in most of the situations with this combination of modern neural networks. And there is no training here except for the demonstrations of the behaviors. So that's the first way of looking at it. just to give you an intuition about what it looks like, it's a bit like writing literature. That's the prompt that we were using in that experiment. You see it's very long. We have to specify the task, the steps, some pattern identification. So we give examples of the expected result. So we have this kind of very long prompt to explain to the large language model what we want, what is the current context, how does that work, and that works quite well. We do other things like this. More low-level problem for robots is, let's say you want to teleoperate a robot, look, explicitly say, put your hand on the book and reach for the cup. But of course, you need to understand what is a cup, what is a book, what does that mean, and maybe correct. Sometimes say, no, a bit more right, and then the robot needs to understand what it means. So that's the kind of things we did here. We again have a similar architecture. So we have a segmentation that is grounded in language. We built some kind of JSON file from that explains what is the position of the object. And then we give this to a large language model.
Here, since the predicted contact was really close to the
So just to place your right hand right from the thing with the wooden under. And that's one of the magic we get with large language models, is that this is like a mallet, I guess. Some people will say hammer, some people will not have any word for it. They might say it's something with a wooden handle. And the large language models and the visual language models can understand all these things, all these synonyms, all the different ways of more or less describing the same thing. For instance, we call this a nail box, but there is no nail inside, but still understood what we meant by this given the context and this kind of common sense. Here we say using the right hand on top of the white surface and then wish for the red plate, I think, or something like this, wish for the plate. And the robot can do it from these vocal instructions. And maybe you have seen it, but that's also what's behind this video, which is 1 year old now, from Figure AI. We mostly use this kind of architecture, at that time at least. There is another way of looking at it to say, yeah, but here we took the symbols back. We need to have this text, which is giving names to things and put them in prompts. We should not do this. We should have emergent representation from data because we know this is what works so far. So the robotics community is trying to do this. So the best attempt in, at least in academia, is called the OpenX embodiment dataset. So there were 22 robots, 21 institutions, more than 500 skills, and that means in the dataset we have more than 150,000 tasks. That's huge. It's a big effort to actually collect all this data, but we're still very, very far from what we have from text. I just checked that Wikipedia alone is 64 million pages. So if we have 100,000 tasks, we're far from 64 million pages. And that's only Wikipedia. Of course, large language models are trained on all the books of the world, not only Wikipedia pages. So we're trying to do the same as what we did with large language models, but for robots. And first thing is data. And then what kind of model can we do? So this is not all work, but I find it like a good illustration of what the community is trying to do right now. It's called OpenVLA, and the goal is to do what we call a VLA, so that vision, language, action. So we have language, we have vision, and we have actions at the end. And we try to put this together. So the way they did it is that they took a large language model here, and they take some visual processing model, and they directly connect to the neurons inside. So they don't go to the text, they directly connect to the latent representation of the model. And then, of course, this connection needs to be done in a specific way with the right weights of the neural network. And this is what is learned from data. So what they learn from data here is only the small things with the gradients here, this MLP projector. So Dino V2, Siglip, Llama, all of this is pre-trained on text and images. And then what they learn is how to connect the internal representation of the visual language model to the internal representation of the large language model. And maybe there are symbols there, maybe not. We don't really know, but we learn from data how to connect these two internal representations. That gives some results. We're still not as far as we'd like to do, but this is very inspiring, I think, because that's a very generic way of looking at the problem. And this is then continued by a company called Physical Intelligence. That's their last paper. That's problem is that as a company, they don't explain everything about how they do it. But we start seeing what we would like to have, which is I ask something and the robot can do it from the instruction without having any explicit symbols, but by combining all these components and training them so that they're connected together in an implicit way. So if you have time, you can watch this video. I find it very, very inspiring. A lot of these tasks are actually very hard to do with robots. And this starts from language instructions, which is also something very interesting to be able to do without these explicit symbols. So to summarize, we had, in my mind, 4 periods in robotics. We started with symbolic AI in the 60s. Then we have this embodied AI in the 90s. So stopped using logic, but use their own representation, learning, reactive behaviors. Around 2011, we started to use deep learning with a lot of data, a lot of computation. And then at that stage, learning algorithms become to be much better than anything else. Before that, learning algorithms were only an academic quest. After these years, we started to see things that are actually much better than anything else. So we more or less solve with this locomotion for like robots. Vision, speech also is working very well now. And starting from 2022, we start having the capability of having some common sense, some dialogue, and some connections. And maybe, we don't know yet, maybe we need to bring back the symbols in that context, or maybe not. It's still an open question, I would say. And just to finish my conclusion, I think large language models are generalist. They do have this common sense. They have some embodiment, implicit embodiment. And this is one reason also you see a lot of humanoid robots, is that humanoid robots are the most generalist robots. And also, if you start shaping their knowledge with human knowledge, it makes much more sense in a humanoid robot. For instance, humans describe the world as they see it, as animals with 2 hands, 2 legs. So we don't know what would be the large language model for a dog. So somehow there is a very deep connection between this kind of AI, generalist AI, large language models, and humanoid robots. That's why you see also all this interest in humanoid robot right now. And yeah, just a few final words. So we started with plan and symbols, then we moved to reactive robots, and now with large language models, a lot of things are changing. Symbols are somehow back, and we'll see if we can make something with them. Okay, that's the end of my talk. I have time for questions, of course. Open to any questions. You can ask questions in French if you prefer.
Thank you very much. First of all, we want to thank you. And now, the usual is the floor is open for questions. I usually have to fill in for a while until people become more brave. But if there's somebody who's ready to raise a hand, either in here, there, okay, good. Who raised first?
Go ahead, vas-y.
Bonjour, merci d'être là avec nous. J'avais une question sur la cybersécurité versus open data qui utilisait le IL. Est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, c'est pris en compte? Est-ce qu'il y a des cadres de gouvernance autour de ça pour... parce qu'on pourrait faire à un robot des choses si on les pirate, j'imagine?
Alors, de manière très... maybe I can answer in English, I don't know.
Yeah, better answer in English, yeah. And if
So
I
she's asking about the cybersecurity of all these robots, and especially if we start asking them to do things that maybe they should not do. And I would say that for this kind of generalist robots, nothing is done so far. That's probably a big research topic for the next years. When you start being able to have a robot to which you can ask many things, it can do many things, including a lot of maybe illegal things, unexpected things, and there is no security on that. And overall, there is not much security for robots. There is a lot of security in the robots in the factories. You have tons of norms to follow and so on because there is a safety of the workers there. So these are not research robots. These robots in the factories have norms and safety measures and so on. But all the robots that we start seeing, like humanoid moving around in the real world, in an open world with language models inside, there are tons of security risks that are completely out of which they are not explored.
Thank you.
Okay, pose ta question.
Oui, bonjour Jean-Baptiste, merci pour la conférence, très intéressant. Ma question, c'est, je crois que vous semblez avoir écarté la possibilité d'utiliser un système hybride qui allait pouvoir profiter et des symboles et d'un système, les nouveaux systèmes connexionnistes. Je me demandais le rationnel, pourquoi en fait vouloir éliminer c'est la capacité de ces systèmes-là de symbolique qui assurent non seulement une transparence, mais ce qui me fait penser à ça, c'est le footage que vous avez montré, la vidéo, le jeune homme qui kickait le robot, puis ça m'a rappelé des lectures d'Asimov avec les 3 lois de la robotique. Et on pourrait penser que le robot, s'il est seulement orienté vers une fonction objective d'optimisation, pourrait dire la façon la plus rapide de rester debout le plus longtemps, ça serait de se débarrasser de celui qui me kick.
Yes, that's a very good question. Should we make hybrid models with symbols? And if we bring back models, we can have guarantees, and guarantees might be very useful for safety. So we can avoid some illegal behaviors, for instance, with formal rules or things like this, and guarantee that they're never broken. That's again, there are many aspects to this question. So first, everything we did like with locomotion is using a very simple reward. And it's clear that when you do working like this, you just disregard everything. So for instance, imagine you're in a disaster recovery scenario. So there is an earthquake, people are lying on the ground. This robot will just work on it. And that's probably not what you want because it's focused on working and is ignoring all the rest. So that's an issue with all these learning algorithms is they tend to ignore a lot of things. So usually what I was saying in the past regarding this kind of what we should do and should not do is actually getting the common sense about what is acceptable in a situation is much harder than walking. So for instance, knowing that after an earthquake, walking on people that are lying on the ground is a bad idea, it's the kind of common sense that is not easy to formalize in any way. But now with large language models, you can actually do it, and maybe we get some common sense in that situation. So maybe things like Asimov laws on this will be good. And the second thing is, should we make like hybrid systems with still symbols and guarantees and a way of reasoning? And I would say at that stage, maybe. Clearly what we do in large language models, so with robots, is sometimes to like use a solver that is doing some formal reasoning on some things to get a complex solution. Because large language models are not very good at reasoning. They are good at this common sense statistical understanding, but what we usually do in that situation. They are not very good at solving a complex problem that requires thinking and so on. So maybe ultimately we'll get some kind of hybrid model. My point of view is still that what we have seen so far is that removing symbols has always been very productive. That is how we got most of the new results. Same thing with language processing. Language processing, so large language models succeeded because we just took data as input and we stopped trying to think about language too much. So far it has been a very successful research direction to try to remove the symbols and not use hybrid systems. But I think the jury is not out. Maybe we'll find the right way of using hybrid systems, and that would be useful.
Very good. Any questions from the remote audience? Please just raise your hand if you want to ask. Otherwise, I'll ask some along the way. Okay, I have a few. First of all, could you please tell me what you mean by implicit embodiment of LLMs?
Yes, that's might not be very clear to me either. Somehow I've been convinced my whole life that we need embodiment to get some way of living in the world, to get the common sense of the world. And I'm trying to find a reason, a way of looking at large language models which are not embodied at all. So how do we get this common sense of the other? And to me, what I call implicit embodiment in that case is that they are built on stories written by humans. So if I tell you my experience of the world with my body and all the experiences of all the people who write stories, like all the fiction, all the non-fiction, all the texts we have, they are written by humans explaining their vision of the world with their eyes. And that creates some experience of the world, which is maybe not that different statistically from an experience that I could get directly from my own sense from the world. So what I mean by that is they're not embodied in the sense that they are not linked to a body, but they are still trained on data that comes from a body. And somehow they get the common sense a bit from that. And that's what I call this implicit embodiment. I don't know if you understand.
Would you call it implicit embodiment if you were using a textbook that was written by a person who had a body and navigated in the world, but you got the information out of the words on the textbook? Would you say that the textbook has implicit embodiment, the textbook?
The textbook itself, no, because it does not have a representation. It cannot create new textbooks from that. But combining all the textbooks of the world, it creates some kind of experience, and which is not that different from I'm moving in the world. I don't know if it's a right way of looking at this, but to me, this is where we get the common sense. Is this embodiment that is not a direct embodiment, but something like an indirect embodiment? Maybe it's a better description of it.
You know, indirect embodiment is getting dangerously close to indirect grounding. And that's playing quite loosely with the notion of grounding. Let's get back to symbols. The original idea is that symbols, which can be of two kinds, not entirely different, symbols in a formal syntactic system, computation, and symbols in a natural language. But they're both symbols. They're simply arbitrary shapes that are manipulated based on their shapes. That's the important thing. It's even in the large language models where you have lots and lots of words that are being used in order to decide how to manipulate. It's all shapes being manipulated. The LLM itself, you know, these LLMs are very well trained to tell you, Sam Altman has trained them to say, I am just an LLM, I don't understand, I don't mean anything, etc. I'm not invoking them as authorities because that is training. But now I ask you, Jean-Baptiste, do they understand?
It's a question is what is understanding? I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
But I think the main question, I mean, the first part of your question is, do they actually create symbols internally? And I do think that the representation that is created by the large language model from data can be called symbols. So they do have symbols inside. I don't know what understand means, but at the end, we are manipulating symbols, but they're created from data and not from our understanding of the world. So that's an emergent properties of ingesting the data in the model.
That has to have a lot of more thought by everybody. But let me ask you an easier question. What is the difference between when you eliminate symbols by doing autonomous reinforcement learning, trial and error, etc.? What's the difference between that and learning that kind of thing from imitation, which means by mirroring functions?
Between imitation and reinforcement learning, in both cases, we get a representation that comes from data. So I do not necessarily see a difference in terms of symbols.
No, this is not a question particularly about symbols. It's just saying what advantages when you're trying to get a robot to do things that you couldn't do before.
It's to me, the main reason, the main difference is can I specify the task easily or not? So walking is relatively easy as a task to define. I can say walk as fast as possible, the fastest you can, follow this trajectory. So that's relatively easy to describe with an equation. And then I can train a robot to maximize some value in that equation. That's why reinforcement learning works very well for locomotion. When we do more open things, I don't know, it's I don't know what kind of things do, like cooking. You want to cook something, what is the reward, that the equation to explain what is good cooking? It's very hard to put in equation. How to measure this? What do we measure for success? We need somehow maybe people to taste it. I don't know, something like this. So it's much easier in that situation to say what you need to do is just to do the same as what you were demonstrated. And then we specify the task like this. So there are many tasks that are much easier to just say, let me show you. And there are tasks that say, I can write an equation that give you a grade.
Let's take one further step. We did reinforcement learning by trial and error. That really is sensory motor learning. Then we talked about mirroring by imitation, where there's something. By the way, is the capacity of robots to imitate unproblematic? I mean, is that a solved problem?
It's not a solved problem, but it's a problem that really moved forward in the last 3 years. So we can now do things that were really hard before, like folding a shirt. It's something that we were completely unable to do, and now we can learn this by imitation.
As you know, in neuroscience, there is a sensation with mirror neurons, and everybody's wondering about what they do and how they do it, and it seemed a miracle. We already knew, of course, that we, human beings and lots of other animals, could imitate, and therefore there was some sort of mirror capacity there. But there was no causal explanation. Do you have a causal explanation in general of how sensory motor robots can do general imitation?
Oh, I don't know about this, honestly. I think the algorithms are quite basic for now. So we'll not be able to draw parallels with life on these algorithms.
Okay, let me move to the next step. You were talking about LLMs. I didn't completely follow this, and maybe you can help. You were talking about using LLMs along with the robots. And there's two things I can think of: giving a robot an LLM and then giving the LLM prompts and then having the robots act on them, or having the LLMs as the source for executing your instructions. What is it actually?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but there is an actual difference. So what we want is to ask something to the robot. Could be a repetitive task, but we ask something. So we always start with a human prompt to say what we want to achieve. No, if the task is go to get some coffee, we start with that prompt. And then this prompt is like increased with a lot of additional information, and then we create a new prompt that says the goal is to fetch the coffee. This is what you can see in an image. This is what I know about the current environment. This is all the knowledge I have. What should I do? Then you ask this to the language model that will start creating some kind of plan. So it's not like the LLM is driving the robot by selecting what to do, but we still start with human request. And I think that's the most common use case. We need to explain to the robot what we want. Otherwise, that's not a generalist robot. It can only do one thing. Here, what we want to do is to say, I can ask you something, and the robot can do it.
In robotics, which is, I think, at the heart of all of this and should be the heart of it all. In robotics, the kind of thing you're describing is what people are focusing on now, which is giving robots instructions to do things that we would like to have them do. But what about autonomous robots autonomous robots that you can speak to and that answer like LLMs?
If you can speak to them, then you're giving them instructions, and we go back to the same question. So the question would be, can we have like a fully autonomous robot that, I don't know, mows the lawn or do something by itself? But it's the same, you always start by asking what you want. So either it's a specialized robot that can do only a single thing, but if it's a generalist robot, at one point you need to ask what we want. And you will go back to maybe not a text prompt, but somewhere specifying what we want.
That's if you see robots as being a project of engineering to produce servants for people to do things. But there are other ways of thinking robots also. When we ask about robot autonomy, and when you asked at the very beginning, what is a robot, and you gave all of the options to your journalists, you left out the option, which is a biological organism, which is also a robot. It's also a sensory-motor system that can learn and that can do the things. And
yes, I see where you're going, and yeah, that's true. That there is something that's missing from that picture is everything that's related to behaviors like curiosity. So defining your own goal. So you could have a robot that decides by itself to do something because it's just exploring, just trying to play, just trying to discover new things by itself. And in that case, that becomes an autonomous system because it's not reacting to what we're asking, but defining its own goal. That's a very interesting topic. We work on things like this. So how to make robots curious that can discover new things by themselves. It's also something that you probably do not want to put directly on robots because they quickly tend to do things that you don't want. So they can be very creative sometimes, like breaking things just to see what happens. So there is a whole field about this. So there are all the options for curiosities. There are everything we did in evolutionary computation, in which we try to discover new things. So we didn't use this much on robots so far because it's difficult, but we use this more like for creating new objects, for instance, creating new objects that are just being creative. And we could imagine the same for skills of robots. I think that's a very valid question, and we will see experiments in that direction. And I think as a research direction, it's very good. But most probably, we need to understand a bit better everything that we're doing now to also get the common sense in these explorations. So everything what we are working on curiosity now is also using a large language models to give intuitions, what is actually possible, what is actually doable. So I don't have an example in my slides, but yeah, that's another degree of autonomy. I fully agree with you. And that's something that is a research topic that's very interesting.
I hope I didn't sound ungrateful because I admire what you do and I think it's extremely informative. If I mention some things that have not yet been done, it is not a discredit, but a challenge.
No, I could do a second talk if you want on that. we actually have a review paper which is like 150 pages long that should be out at one point with many authors about how to get this open-ended creative behaviors from language models and all the things we tried so far, us and all the whole community in robotics and AI to get this, but it's a very different topic, so that's why I didn't prepare much. But
that's very good. I didn't specify the topic, but it's not a different topic for us because we're interested in that too here. So maybe we'll invite you again when the papers were closer to ready. Besides that, I want to just thank you for coming all the way from Nancy to Montreal for this, to give this talk. It was extremely stimulating and extremely imagination provoking. Peter, did you want to ask a question or just want to applaud? Peter?
Correct. That was incompetent applause.
Oh, okay, thank you. So many thanks, Jean-Baptiste, and the video will soon be available if people didn't get a chance to come this time. They'll have the video of the talk within a few hours. Merci d'être venu, Jean-Baptiste.
Merci pour l'invitation. Merci.